It was a warm Friday afternoon and the city streets were buzzing with people heading home from work. The police captain had just finished a long week of shifts and finally had a few hours to herself. She parked her car near a large department store on the edge of town. For once, she wasn't in uniform. She wore jeans, a plain gray shirt, and a small cap to stay low-key. After years of being recognized everywhere she went, she was glad to blend in like an ordinary person. She wasn't there for anything important, just some groceries, a gift for her niece, and a few things for the house. She grabbed a small basket and wandered through the aisles. It felt nice to walk without her radio crackling or someone calling her captain every few minutes. She looked around at the families shopping, the children laughing, and the young employees restocking shelves. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. But while she was busy comparing two brands of coffee, a small misunderstanding was already brewing in another corner of the store. A young store clerk had reported a suspicious woman seen in the electronics section earlier. Someone who had picked up a few items and seemed to walk past the registers without paying. The security staff began checking camera footage. The woman they saw on the screen wore a gray shirt and jeans. It was an ordinary outfit, and when the off-duty captain passed near that same section, they mistook her for the same person. She had no idea that anyone was watching her. After she finished shopping, she walked toward the self-checkout counter, scanned her items, and paid using her card. As she placed the receipt in her bag, she noticed two men standing near the exit, whispering and looking in her direction. She thought nothing of it. She picked up her bags and started walking toward the door, humming quietly to herself. One of the men, a store security guard, pressed his radio and spoke softly. "She's heading out now," he said. "Same clothing. Let's get confirmation." Outside the store, a patrol car had just arrived. The two responding officers were told that the suspect might have concealed items in her bag. The report didn't include her name, only her description. So when the officers saw a woman in casual clothes carrying store bags, they assumed it was her. The captain stopped at the door to adjust her bag. That's when one of the guards stepped forward. "Ma'am, could you stop for a second?" he asked politely. She turned, a little surprised. "Yes, is something wrong?" Before she could say more, the two officers approached quickly. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you for a moment," one said, his tone firm but calm. "Can we check your bag, please?" She blinked, confused. "My bag? I just paid for my things. Is there a problem?" The second officer exchanged a quick glance with the guard. "We got a report of shoplifting. You match the description. We'll just need to clear this up." Her heart dropped. She had handled hundreds of situations like this before, but always from the other side. Never had she been the one being questioned. She tried to stay calm. "Officer, there must be a mistake." "I'm with the department," she said, reaching into her pocket for her wallet. But before she could pull out her ID, the first officer raised his hand. "Please, ma'am, don't reach into your pocket right now. We'll talk in a second. Just step aside." People nearby had started to notice the scene. A few shoppers slowed down, whispering. One even took out a phone and started recording. The captain felt her throat tighten. "Listen," she said carefully. "I'm a police captain. I just finished my shift. I'm off duty. You can check my badge." "Ma'am, we'll verify that later," the officer interrupted. "Right now, please cooperate. Put your hands where I can see them." She froze, realizing what was about to happen. Her instincts told her to comply, even though every part of her wanted to shout that this was ridiculous. Slowly, she lifted her hands. The guard looked uneasy now, unsure if they were doing the right thing. But the officers, following standard procedure, moved closer and placed handcuffs around her wrists. A small crowd had gathered. Some people murmured things like, "What did she do?" And "She doesn't look like a thief." The captain kept quiet, her eyes fixed on the ground. She could feel dozens of eyes watching, phones recording, whispers spreading. "Officer, please," she said softly. "Let me explain. My badge is in my pocket. My name is—" "We'll get to that at the station," one of them said, keeping his tone professional. He clearly didn't want to argue in public. They guided her toward the patrol car. The guard followed, trying to explain. "She looks like the woman from the footage we saw earlier, same clothes, maybe it's just—" But the captain wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was spinning. She'd spent years training officers on how to de-escalate situations like this, on how to listen and observe before acting. And now she was living through a mistake that seemed straight out of a training manual gone wrong. At the station, as they processed her, she finally spoke again. "Please check my identification," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. One of the officers took her wallet and opened it. The room fell silent for a second. The officer stared at the badge inside, then at her. His expression changed instantly. "Oh no," he muttered almost to himself. He looked up at her, realization and embarrassment flooding his face. "Captain? You're with Central Division?" She nodded slowly, saying nothing. The other officer, now pale, stepped back. "We didn't know," he said quickly. "We just got a report and followed the description." She took a deep breath. "I understand you were doing your job," she said quietly, though her voice carried a sharp edge of pain. "But next time look closer before you handcuff someone, especially one of your own." The two officers apologized repeatedly, but the damage was done. By the time they released her, videos of her arrest were already circulating online. The story had taken on a life of its own before she even made it home. When she reached her car, she sat for a long time, staring out the windshield. The sky had darkened, and the lights from the station flickered against the glass. She wasn't angry, at least not yet. What she felt was something deeper: disbelief, humiliation, and a sense that something inside her had shifted. She had always believed that the system worked as long as everyone did their job right, but today showed her how quickly things could fall apart when communication failed. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from a fellow officer who had already seen the video. "Is this really you?" it read. She turned the screen face down and closed her eyes. Driving home later that night, she couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head, the look in the officer's eyes, the clicking sound of the handcuffs, the whispers of strangers. She knew how the system worked. There would be reports, explanations, maybe even an apology. But she also knew how the world outside the department would see it. A police captain, off duty, being arrested like a common suspect. She tried to tell herself it was just a misunderstanding, but deep down, it felt like more than that. It was a reminder that no one was really protected from mistakes, not even those who wore the badge. At home, she placed her badge on the table and sat beside it. The metal gleamed under the dim kitchen light. It had always symbolized pride and authority for her. Tonight, it looked different, like a mirror reflecting something she didn't want to see. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. She thought about calling someone, maybe a colleague or a friend, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. How would she even explain what had happened? That she, a captain with years of service, had been handcuffed and taken in front of a crowd because no one stopped to listen? She took a deep breath and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands were still trembling slightly. Tomorrow she would have to face the department. There would be questions, awkward looks, and maybe even laughter from those who didn't understand. But for now she sat quietly, staring at her reflection in the window. Outside, sirens echoed in the distance, faint and familiar. Usually that sound meant she was needed somewhere, that someone else was in trouble. But tonight it just reminded her of how fragile everything could be. She didn't sleep much. Her mind kept returning to the same thought, that one small error, one quick assumption, had turned an ordinary shopping trip into a public ordeal. And if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, she finally decided what she would do. She wouldn't hide from it. She would tell the truth no matter how uncomfortable it was. Maybe her story could change something. Maybe it could remind people, inside and outside the uniform, that everyone deserves to be seen clearly before they're judged. And so, as the city woke up to a new day, she prepared herself for what was coming. She didn't know it yet, but this moment would set off a chain of events that would challenge her faith in the system she'd dedicated her life to, and force the department to look inward like never before. The morning after her arrest, the city woke up to a buzz of rumors and half-told stories. Videos of the off-duty captain being handcuffed in front of the store were already making rounds on social media. Some people defended the officers, saying they were just doing their job. Others criticized them, wondering how they could arrest someone from their own department without checking first. The captain herself hadn't even looked at her phone since the night before. She didn't need to. She already knew how fast these things spread. When she finally walked into the station later that morning, the usual chatter in the hallway fell silent. Officers who had worked under her looked away awkwardly. A few gave her sympathetic glances but said nothing. She could feel the air thick with curiosity and embarrassment. Nobody wanted to be the one to bring it up, but everyone was thinking the same thing. How did this happen? Her commanding officer called her into the office. He looked tired, maybe even worried. "I saw the footage," he said quietly, gesturing for her to sit down. "This shouldn't have happened." "You know that," she nodded. "I know, but it did," he sighed. "The department is reviewing the incident. The media's already picked it up. They're calling it a case of mistaken identity. Still, we can't ignore how it looks." She leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of it all. "I didn't expect special treatment," she said. "But the way it was handled, it's not just about me. This shows how quickly assumptions turn into action." He nodded slowly. "You're right. And that's exactly why we're starting an internal review." Outside the office, whispers continued. Everyone wanted to know what she would do next. Would she file a complaint? Would she resign? Or would she fight back quietly from within the system? That afternoon, she sat in her car for a long time before heading home. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of that night. The flash of the patrol lights, the sound of the handcuffs clicking, the way people had looked at her like she was a criminal. She had spent years earning respect, only for one misunderstanding to turn it all upside down. Later that day, she received a message from one of the younger officers who had been at the scene. It read, "Ma'am, I'm really sorry about what happened. We didn't know. We were told to act fast." She stared at the message for a while before replying, "I understand. But next time, make sure you know before you act. That's all I ask." She didn't blame them entirely. They had followed procedure based on the information they had. But that didn't erase the humiliation she had felt in that moment, or the way the world had seen it. By the next evening, the story had reached local news stations. Reporters stood outside the department building, filming segments about the arrest that raised questions about internal communication. They didn't use her name, but everyone knew who it was. At home, she watched one of the news clips. It showed her being led away from the store, her hands cuffed, her expression calm but clearly pained. The caption at the bottom read, "Off-duty police captain mistaken for shoplifting suspect." She turned off the TV. The sound of the reporter's voice made her stomach twist. The following week was a blur of meetings, statements, and awkward encounters. She was temporarily placed on leave while the department reviewed the case. Officially, it was standard procedure. Unofficially, it felt like a suspension dressed up in polite words. She didn't argue. She needed time to think anyway. During those quiet days, she realized how much her job had defined her life. She had joined the force young, believing in justice, fairness, and discipline. Over the years, she had trained officers, handled crises, and made difficult decisions. She had faced danger on the streets, but never imagined that humiliation would come from her own workplace. Each night, she would sit on her balcony with a cup of tea, staring at the lights of the city. Somewhere out there, officers were patrolling, responding to calls, keeping people safe. She had always felt pride knowing she was part of that. But now that pride felt distant, shaken like a building hit by a small but deep crack. A few days later, she was called back to the station for a formal statement. The same two officers who had arrested her were also there. They looked uncomfortable, standing in the hallway, unsure if they should greet her or stay quiet. She broke the tension by giving a small nod. In the interview room, the internal affairs officer asked her to recount everything that happened. She spoke calmly, describing the events step by step. She didn't raise her voice or exaggerate. When she finished, the officer nodded, making notes. "Thank you, Captain," he said. "We'll continue to review the evidence." Outside the room, one of the arresting officers approached her hesitantly. "I just wanted to say again, I'm sorry. We really didn't know it was you." She studied his face for a moment. He was young, probably in his late 20s, eager to do the right thing. She could see the regret in his eyes. "You were following orders," she said softly. "But remember, orders don't replace judgment. Sometimes you have to slow down and see the person in front of you." He nodded, his eyes lowered. "Yes, ma'am." When she left the station that day, she felt lighter. Not because things were fixed, but because she had finally said what needed to be said. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. The review would take weeks, maybe months. In the meantime, the public conversation was growing louder. Talk shows discussed the incident. Commentators debated whether it showed bias within the department or simply poor communication. Online, people shared their own experiences of being misunderstood or wrongly accused. Some said the captain's calm reaction showed professionalism. Others wondered if things would have gone differently if she hadn't been part of the force. Through it all, she stayed silent. She didn't post statements or give interviews. She didn't want to fuel the noise. But deep down, she knew this story wasn't going away. It had become bigger than her. One evening, she received a call from a retired officer she deeply respected. "I saw what happened," he said. "It's a tough situation, but maybe it's a chance to make things better. Sometimes change starts when the wrong person gets caught in the right mess." His words stayed with her. For years, she had trained officers to handle tense situations with empathy and awareness. Maybe this was her turn to teach something again, just in a different way. A week later, she attended a private meeting with senior officials to discuss the department's next steps. The chief acknowledged the mistake publicly, calling it an unfortunate incident that demands introspection. They talked about new procedures for verifying identification, better communication between divisions, and the importance of judgment in the field. As she listened, she realized how easily such errors could happen, not just because of carelessness, but because of habit. The system was built on quick decisions and rigid steps. It worked well most of the time, but when it failed, the consequences were personal and painful. After the meeting, she stepped outside and watched the sun setting behind the buildings. The sky was painted in soft orange and pink, calm and steady. For the first time in days, she felt a small sense of peace. She still carried the weight of the embarrassment, but it no longer felt like the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning of a different chapter, a chance to remind the department that being right wasn't just about following rules, but about seeing people clearly. At home that night, she finally scrolled through her phone. Dozens of messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers filled her inbox. Some offered support, others shared similar stories of misunderstanding. She read each one carefully. There was comfort in knowing that people cared, that others saw her not as a headline but as a human being who went through something painful. She sat back and looked at her reflection in the dark screen. The same calm face stared back, but her eyes looked wiser now, maybe even stronger. It was strange, she thought, how one mistake, someone else's mistake, had forced her to see her own world differently. She wasn't angry anymore, just aware of how fragile trust could be, and how easily it could be restored with honesty and humility. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she whispered to herself, "This isn't over yet. But maybe it's leading somewhere good." And with that quiet thought, she lay down, knowing that her story had only just begun to unfold. Somewhere inside, she felt that what had started as a moment of humiliation might one day become a reason for change, something that could make her department and the people in it just a little better. The week after the incident felt heavier than any case the captain had ever handled. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of eyes on her, even if they weren't really there. The world hadn't forgotten what happened. It had simply moved on to talking about it from a distance, while she still lived inside the storm. The department tried to stay professional. Officially, they said the investigation was ongoing. Unofficially, everyone had an opinion. Some said the officers were only doing their job. Others said it was unthinkable that a captain, someone they'd trained under, respected, could be treated that way. She could hear whispers in the hallways whenever she passed, quiet voices that went silent the moment she looked their way. At home, she tried to find peace, but even simple things reminded her of that day. Her uniform hung neatly in the closet, untouched since the incident. Each time she saw it, she felt both pride and pain. The badge that once symbolized trust now carried the memory of humiliation. One afternoon, she sat by her window with a cup of tea, watching the city below. The streets looked ordinary. Children walking from school, cars passing, people chatting outside small shops. Life moved on as it always did. Yet inside her, something had changed. She used to feel confident, grounded in her role. Now she felt uncertain, as if the ground beneath her had cracked just a little. Her phone rang. It was her niece, cheerful as always. "Auntie, are you coming to my school event this weekend?" the little voice asked. She smiled faintly. "Of course. I wouldn't miss it." The innocence in her niece's tone made her heart soften. It reminded her that outside all the noise and judgment, she still had people who saw her for who she was, not what the news said. Later that evening, she scrolled through the news. Articles still mentioned her case, though not by name. Police captain arrested by mistake raises. Questions about procedure, one headline read. Another said, Department under pressure to improve training after incident. She closed the page quickly, not wanting to feed the ache inside her, but she couldn't avoid it completely. Reporters left messages asking for interviews. Some of her colleagues suggested she speak publicly, share her side of the story. Others warned her to stay quiet until the review ended. She decided on silence for now. Words, she felt, would only make the noise louder. The review team continued to collect statements, videos, and reports. Every few days she was called in for more questions. Each meeting felt like reopening a wound. She answered patiently, but the memories replayed in her mind each time. The confused faces of the officers, the murmurs of the crowd, the sound of metal cuffs clicking. One night as she lay awake, she thought about all the people she had trained during her career. She had taught them to be patient, to listen carefully, to read a situation before reacting. Yet that night in the store, none of those lessons had reached her. It wasn't just a failure of protocol, it was a failure of connection. She began writing down her thoughts in a notebook. Not for the report, not for the department, just for herself. Page after page, she wrote about what she saw, what she felt, what she believed had gone wrong. The words came slowly at first, then all at once, as if she had been holding her breath for days. She wrote about how fear and haste often took control during field calls. How officers, even with good intentions, sometimes forgot the human side of their job. She didn't write out of anger. She wrote because she wanted to understand. A few days later, one of her close colleagues stopped by her house. He was one of the few who treated her the same as before. He sat across from her, hands clasped. The department's under a lot of pressure, he said gently. But people still respect you. Some even say this could lead to change. She looked at him with tired eyes. Change doesn't come easily, she said, especially in a place where everyone's used to doing things the same way. He nodded. Maybe. But sometimes it takes something uncomfortable to open everyone's eyes. After he left, she thought about his words for a long time. Maybe this moment, painful as it was, could become more than just an embarrassment. Maybe it could become a reason to look deeper into how things worked. The next morning, she went for a walk through her neighborhood. The air was cool, the streets quiet. A few people recognized her from the news, but no one approached. She appreciated that small kindness. For the first time in days, she felt a little lighter. That afternoon, she received a call from the department's internal affairs team. They asked her to attend a roundtable meeting with senior officers and training supervisors. The goal, they said, was to discuss potential reforms in handling civilian interactions and identification verification. She hesitated for a moment, then agreed. She wasn't sure what good it would do, but she wanted to face it. The meeting was formal but tense. Around the table sat officers, supervisors, and a few department lawyers. The internal affairs officer began by summarizing the findings so far. The arrest appears to have been the result of miscommunication between the store's security staff and responding officers, he said. However, the event has highlighted areas where our verification and communication protocols can be improved. When it was her turn to speak, the room grew quiet. She took a slow breath and looked around at the familiar faces. I've worked in this department most of my life, she began softly. I've seen good officers make bad choices, not because they meant harm, but because they stopped seeing the person in front of them. That's what happened that night. I wasn't angry about being stopped. I was angry because no one listened when I tried to explain. No one interrupted her. Some nodded slightly. We're trained to act quickly, she continued, but sometimes quick decisions can cloud judgment. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for awareness. We owe that to each other and to the people we serve. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the chief spoke quietly. Thank you, he said. We'll take your words into account as we move forward. She left the meeting feeling strangely calm. She didn't know if her words would make a real difference, but saying them aloud felt like lifting a weight she had carried alone. That evening, as she walked home, her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a message from the department. It was a short video someone had posted online. It showed her being arrested that day, but now it was followed by another clip, a news segment talking about the department's internal review and possible reforms. The comments below the video were mixed, but one stood out. It said, "It's easy to judge from a distance. But look at how she handled it, with calm and dignity. That's strength." She read it twice, then put her phone down. Maybe people were beginning to see the bigger picture. Days turned into weeks. The investigation neared its end and the public conversation began to quiet. Inside the department, small changes were already being discussed. New guidelines for off-duty identification, clearer communication between officers and dispatchers, and a reminder to always verify before acting. She wasn't sure if those changes would last, but it gave her a small sense of hope. One night, she stood outside her home looking up at the stars. The city lights made it hard to see many, but a few shone clearly through the haze. She thought about all the people who had reached out, the messages of support, the quiet nods from fellow officers who hadn't found the right words to say it aloud. For the first time since the incident, she smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because she had survived the worst of it. She had faced humiliation, confusion, and silence, and somehow she was still standing. The next morning, she put on her uniform again. It felt strange at first, but when she looked in the mirror, she saw more than the badge or the rank. She saw someone who had been tested and had learned something real. As she stepped outside, ready to return to work, she knew things wouldn't go back to exactly how they were, but maybe that was the point. Maybe they weren't supposed to. Weeks passed, and the internal review was in full motion. The department was trying to handle the situation carefully. They wanted to show the public that they were serious about accountability, but they also wanted to protect their officers from unfair judgment. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Everyone felt like they were walking on eggshells. Conversations about the incident were whispered, never loud. The captain had returned to duty by then, but things were different. She could feel the change in how people looked at her. Some greeted her with genuine warmth, happy to see her back. Others avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. There was no hostility, just an uneasy silence that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She decided not to dwell on it. Every morning she arrived early like she always had, reviewing reports and checking in with her team. She refused to let the incident define her, even though she knew everyone still thought about it. One afternoon, the internal review committee called her in again. This time the room was full. Senior officers, internal affairs representatives, and even a few community observers. The department wanted transparency, and that meant letting outside voices hear what was happening. The head of the review team began. "We're here to discuss the findings from the investigation and the next steps. The incident involving your arrest was unfortunate, but it has also revealed some areas that need improvement." The captain listened quietly, her hands folded on the table. The committee went through the timeline, reviewing the store's security footage, the call logs, and the officer's actions. Everything was laid out carefully. When they reached the part where she identified herself as a police officer, the room grew quiet. The investigator paused the footage. "This moment," he said, "shows where things could have gone differently. The communication gap started here." She didn't flinch. She knew that already. One of the senior officers spoke next. "It's clear that the responding officers acted based on limited information. But we also recognize that our current policies didn't give them the right tools to verify identification quickly. That needs to change." The community observer, a calm older woman sitting near the corner, raised her hand. "If that captain hadn't been part of your department," she said softly, "would anyone have cared this much about fixing it?" Her question lingered in the air. No one had a ready answer. After a pause, the chief spoke. "You're right," he admitted. "We should care about every incident like this, no matter who it happens to. And that's why we're reviewing our procedures, not just because it involved one of our own." The captain looked around the table, her eyes steady. She appreciated the honesty in his tone. Over the next few hours, the team discussed new measures, improving communication between dispatch and responding officers, updating the verification system, and reinforcing empathy in training programs. The captain shared her own suggestions, speaking from both experience and pain. "When officers are called to a scene," she said, "they're often under pressure. But training shouldn't only focus on control, it should also focus on awareness. We can't lose the human side of our job, because once we do, we stop seeing people as individuals." The room was quiet again, but this time it was thoughtful silence. By the end of the meeting, several members thanked her for her input. The chief assured her that her experience would help shape the reforms they were planning. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something close to it, a sense that maybe all of this had a purpose. When she walked out of the room, a few younger officers waiting in the hallway stood straighter as she passed. One of them said quietly, "Glad you're back, ma'am." She nodded and gave a small smile. It wasn't much, but it reminded her that respect could be rebuilt, not through authority but through resilience. Outside, the afternoon sun was fading. The sky was golden, streaked with pale orange light. She stood there for a moment, letting the warmth touch her face. For weeks, she had felt like she was living under a cloud of judgment. Now, for the first time, she felt a small shift. It wasn't over yet, but something was changing. The internal review became the talk of the department. People were curious about what would come from it. Some officers felt defensive, worried the new policies might make their jobs harder. Others welcomed the changes, saying they were long overdue. The captain stayed focused on her work. Whenever someone asked her about the review, she answered calmly. "We're learning," she'd say. "That's what matters." One evening, after another long day, she sat in her office alone. On her desk were reports, notes from the committee, and a few letters from community members. One letter caught her eye. It was handwritten from a retired police sergeant she had once trained under. It read, "I heard about what happened and what you're doing now. Don't let this make you bitter. Let it make you better. The system changes when people like you stay in it long enough to push it forward." She read the letter twice, feeling a quiet sense of strength grow inside her. Over the next few weeks, the department started implementing small reforms. Dispatchers received new training on how to confirm off-duty identification. Officers were reminded to verify, not assume. Supervisors held sessions on communication under pressure. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Reporters followed the changes closely, often waiting outside the station to get comments. When one of them asked her how she felt about the reforms, she simply said, "It's a start. Mistakes are lessons when you choose to learn from them." Her calm, thoughtful words were quoted in several news articles. People online began to see her not just as someone who had been humiliated, but as someone who handled it with grace and determination. Still, the nights were difficult. There were moments when the memory replayed without warning, the sound of the cuffs, the flash of cameras, the quiet gasp from the crowd. Sometimes she woke up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, her hands clenched. She would sit up, take a deep breath, and remind herself, "It's over. It's behind me." But deep down she knew it would never be completely gone. Experiences like that left small scars that time only softened, never erased. One evening, while leaving the precinct, she ran into the same officer who had arrested her. He looked uneasy but approached her respectfully. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you," he said, "for not holding it against us, and for speaking up during the review. It opened my eyes." She studied his face for a moment. There was sincerity there, an honesty that came from learning something the hard way. "We all make mistakes," she said softly. "What matters is what we do after them." He nodded. "I won't forget that." She walked away feeling something close to closure. Not forgiveness exactly. It had never been about blame, but understanding. As weeks turned into a month, the review neared its end. The committee prepared a final report, outlining the findings and recommended actions. It would soon be presented to the public. The department wanted to show transparency, to rebuild trust. When the report was finally released, it stated that the arrest had resulted from miscommunication, poor coordination, and a lack of clear policy on handling off-duty officers. It concluded that there had been no intentional misconduct, but it called for significant procedural updates. The captain read the report quietly at her desk. It was fair, she thought. Honest. It didn't point fingers. It focused on fixing what was broken. Later that day, the chief gathered the department for a short address. "We've learned a hard lesson," he said. "This incident reminded us that even within our own ranks, we must treat everyone with the same respect we ask from the public. Our goal isn't just to enforce the law, but to uphold humanity." As he spoke, the captain looked around at the faces of her colleagues. Some looked inspired, others thoughtful. A few even looked relieved. When the meeting ended, she stepped outside and looked up at the sky again. The air felt different, Lighter, maybe because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was walking under a shadow. She felt steady, strong. It wasn't about clearing her name anymore. It was about moving forward, carrying the lesson with her and helping others learn from it too. As she walked to her car, the evening breeze brushed against her face. The city lights flickered to life one by one. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint wail of a siren, a sound she'd always associated with duty. This time, it didn't remind her of pain. It reminded her of purpose. The weeks after the internal review were quieter but not empty. The department had implemented several of the recommended changes, and while some officers adjusted easily, others struggled to accept the new protocols. For the captain, returning fully to her normal routine was both comforting and strange. She no longer felt like the same person who had walked into that store months ago. Each morning she arrived early, checking her emails, reviewing incident reports, and speaking to officers about their work. She noticed subtle changes in their behavior, more careful communication, more attention to detail, and surprisingly, more willingness to ask questions before acting. She felt a quiet pride, not because of herself, but because the department was learning to grow. The story of her arrest had faded from national headlines, but locally, it remained a topic of conversation. Community members often approached her in public, not to gossip, but to share personal experiences of misunderstanding or unfair treatment. Some thanked her for handling the situation calmly, even under stress. Others asked questions about how they could improve relationships between police and the public. She answered patiently, using her experience to offer guidance. One afternoon, she received a letter from a local school. The principal had written to invite her to speak at a community safety seminar. "We want our students to learn about responsibility, empathy, and courage," the letter read. "Your experience provides an important lesson for everyone." She smiled as she read it. Speaking to students about her story felt like a chance to turn something negative into a positive. She accepted the invitation immediately. The seminar day arrived, and she stood in front of a group of young faces. Their eyes were curious, some wide with the innocence of youth, others cautious, trying to understand someone in uniform who had also experienced vulnerability. She told them her story honestly, without dramatization, but with a clear message about the importance of patience, listening, and verifying facts before making judgments. One student raised a hand. "Are you scared it could happen again?" he asked. She paused before answering. "Scared? Not really. But I am cautious. I know mistakes happen. What matters is how we respond and learn from them." The room was silent for a moment, then several students nodded. She could see the lesson landing, not just in words, but in their expressions. After the seminar, she returned to the station feeling lighter. The city outside moved on with its usual rhythm, but she felt more grounded. She understood that her story was no longer just about her humiliation. It had become a lesson in resilience, empathy, and reflection. Back at the station, the final stages of the internal review were wrapping up. The department issued a formal report, outlining the steps they would take to prevent similar incidents. It included updated protocols for verifying identification, better communication between security and responding officers, and improved training on de-escalation and empathy. While some officers grumbled at the added procedures, most recognized their value. The captain read the report carefully. It was thorough, fair, and honest. Most importantly, it acknowledged that mistakes were inevitable, but systems could improve. She felt a small sense of closure, not because the past was erased, but because it had been recognized and addressed.